This is the result of hundreds of hours spent in the studio. Pain, misery, joy, happiness, enlightenment. All of the emotions involved in this creative journey, I'd like to welcome you to Self-Teaching for Artists. And here is an image of our model Dacia, and I'm going to keep a picture of her to the top left corner of your screen so you can follow along as the painting develops. And as always, if you would like to have access to this photo reference, I have a link to my Facebook photo reference group in the description box down below. Now, I have so much to say on this topic of self-teaching and in particular self-improvement for artists, as I'm mostly self-taught, though I have attributed a lot of my learning to some of the great teachers that I've had in the past. So self-teaching is going to be the subtopic to the main topic of this week's episode, which is going to be, of course, the painting demonstration. As you're seeing here, just using a set of simple straight lines and angles to execute the block in, nothing difficult here. You're seeing the same kind of starts that I have always used both in classical and in Alla Prima approach, just trying to break down each one of these complex forms into straight lines and angles using burnt umber as my preferred drawing color. So with self-improvement or with self-teaching in painting, the very first element and one of the most important elements, I think, is your passion for art. And get ready for this. To the left here, you're seeing a painting that I created on this YouTube channel back in 2017, and to the right is the painting that will be demonstrated in this week's episode. Now, that is a big change. A big change has occurred in my work from 2017 to where we are currently, 2019. So the way I started is the same, actually, the same type of approach that you've seen. You've seen this approach in so many of my videos. I've said the same kind of things, simple straight lines and angles, using burnt umber as my drawing color, and now you're seeing I'm mixing up the color value web. And don't worry, I will be listing out these colors that I'm using for this painting. So it's just the titanium white, the yellow ochre for the lightest light, and then the burnt umber and the alizarin permanent in the middle tones, along with the yellow ochre to get some of these more rich darks. Now back to the subtopic of self-improvement. Now the thing is, if you want to improve on your art, you first have to define what that means for your own art. Now I know I just read out the colors for you. The darker dark is going to be with burnt umber, and I'm using a little bit of alizarin permanent in the darker tones just to add a little bit of a darker tint. And I am using a Liquin as my medium to make the paint dry overnight. As I read in some of the comments, that Liquin does tend to help the paintings dry a little bit faster. And in particular, it did help to dry a little faster than the Neil McGilp. And now, what I want you to do is list out your 5 favorite painters. They could be alive today or from the past. My 5 favorite oil painters are John Singer Sargent, John William Waterhouse, Nelson Shanks, William Bouguereau, and Alma Tadema. Now, in the comment section down below, go ahead and comment down your 5 favorite painters of all time. And now what I want you to do is not try to paint exactly like your favorite painters. What I want you to do is to find patterns or rhythms in the artwork of your favorite painters of the past. Figure out what it is that you enjoy so much about their artwork and see how you can harness that same type of visual poetry that they have in their artwork. And now I know that the painting footage is going by a little bit more quickly in this week's episode. So what you're seeing is I'm developing the planes in a very simplified fashion, very much in the Alla Prima fashion. And what I'm doing with this painting in particular is I'm combining the Alla Prima start to an oil painting, meaning combining the wet on wet approach that you've seen, and in particular in my much older videos where the paintings are quote unquote less realistic. I'm taking this kind of approach to the start of the painting, and then as each day goes by, I believe that I worked on this painting about 6 days throughout the week, which is also kind of difficult to to work on a painting 6 days in a row and still upload on the seventh day. You know what I mean? But in any case, I took that same kind of approach of the Alla Prima start, just working with simple big planes, as you're seeing here. The color combinations are very simple. The yellow ochre, titanium white, flake white, in the lighter lights. Of course, there's an influence of the burnt umber and alizarin permanent. Burnt umber, alizarin permanent, and sap green mixed together in the middle tones can give you that kind of rich type of flesh tone that you're seeing here. And you may be listening and wondering, what? I worked on this painting 6 days and was still able to upload this. Yes, and that's another factor that's going to be involved in the self-teaching and self-improvement. Now that you know what you're trying to achieve after you have, listed out your 5 favorite artists and try to figure out for yourself, do you want to paint more realistically, photorealistically, naturalistically, which is what I'm trying to go after. Once you have established where you're trying to head with your artwork, the next thing to do is to put in the thousands of hours necessary to progress. And it is not easy. They call this artwork for a reason. I know that's very cliche to say. As you're seeing, I'm building up the planes here. Again, nothing too complicated with the start of this painting. Now, there is going to be some glazing involved in the next few days, which will go by in a couple minutes, really. And I'll explain when I get to the more kind of advanced stages when we get to it. But now, the hours and hours that you spend on a painting, it really, really takes a certain discipline. And let me know if you can relate to this. There can be times when you're painting and it is heartbreaking when you're working on a painting for so long just to be discouraged with the mouth or the nose being too far down. Or if it's a figure painting, some kind of major proportional issue, it's heartbreaking when you put in that much effort and then things they just go astray. But that is the nature of all of this. And now we are going to be transitioning into the second day. So as I mentioned, I used Liquin in the start of the painting, and the palette has the same colors on it. I just cleaned off the mixing space with a razor blade and then put the palette in the freezer overnight to prevent the paints from drying too much. And on the second day, what I'm going to do is again mix the color value web. As you saw there, I just went right to the mixtures rather than reading out the combinations all over again. As you know, in the middle tones, the kind of flesh tones that you're wondering about are a combination of the burnt umber, sap green, and alizarin permanent. And in particular, you want to use your flake white in the middle tones if you can. If you don't have flake white, just the tiniest bit of titanium white will work. And now I'm mixing up a little bit of the yellow ochre, titanium white, and a little bit of the sap green, just a tiny bit of sap green. And now we're going to put in some of the still life elements in this painting. So again, going at it Alla Prima wet on wet. If you're new to this channel, Alla Prima just means painting in wet on wet. And I tend to refer to it as the Fast and Furious way of approaching a painting. You don't normally see a classical painting start in this way, but lately I've just kind of adapted this type of technique into my more finished and more developed paintings. Now, back to the topic of self improvement. As I said, it can be heartbreaking when paintings don't go our way. And let me tell you, this same week that I was producing this painting, I did go through some heartbreak, not only with this painting, but with pretty much all of my other paintings. And they just kind of go through this type of cycle. Sometimes when you're painting, you're on top of the world. You really feel like, you're creating a masterpiece in your own mind. You're telling yourself, hey, I'm creating a masterpiece. And then you go to lunch and you come back and then you look at the painting. For instance, I go to lunch, come back, look at my painting, and I'm just astonished at how horrible my painting looks. And if this kind of thing happens to you, don't worry, you're not alone. Again, it's part of the learning process to, be able to go through that type of heartbreak, that type of struggle. Now, let's take a moment to talk about what just happened with the painting. So I just put in a bluish ground for the background and a kind of greenish tone for the drapery that the model's wearing. I'm doing one final little proportion check here just to make sure that the mouth lines up with the eye. So yes, I laid down a tone of a sky blue, basically for the background, meaning kind of bluish, leaning towards the yellow kind of color. There's the conclusion of the second day. Now we're moving on to the third day that I worked on this painting. So I took a lot of liberties with the background of this painting, and I did crop the photo reference just so I don't get in trouble with YouTube, because the model's shoulder is showing a little bit. And so what I'm doing is I'm inventing the background. So the background is going to have clouds, going to look like a middle of the day kind of landscape with a little bit of mountains going off and receding into the background with a little bit of atmospheric perspective. And all of that's just kind of something that I'm making up for this painting. What I'm not making up, however, or I'm not trying to make up, is these areas right here, and I'm actually glazing now at this point. So what I did was I laid down a layer of the Liquin on the entire face, and then I went over top of the face with my more transparent red, the alizarin permanent. And now we're going to be transitioning into the fourth day that I worked on this painting. And again, remember, I said that it takes a certain amount of dedication and time to create these paintings. Each day I worked on this painting was a little more than a couple hours, give or take, each day. So it did take quite a long time to produce this painting, and I may even give myself 2 weeks now per painting, uh, per upload. I'm going to see how I can manage to still upload once a week, but just know that, and for me in particular, if you're wondering how my paintings have progressed to a more kind of realistic realm of imagery, it has a lot to do with the timing. And now I'm going to move into another aspect of uh, improving on your artwork as I paint in this background here. So I went in with the same kind of color, the ultramarine blue, titanium white, a little bit of sap green and yellow ochre just to tint the sky a little bit. Now atmospheric perspective is going to be a thing. So things that go further away are going to be cooler. Things that go further away are going to be uh, lighter, and they're going to be in general less dark. Well, that kind of means the same thing, but you know what I mean. The sky further away is going to be lighter. There aren't going to be as many kind of browns and greens as much, so I kind of tinted the sky with a more deep kind of rich blue, just slightly leaning towards the yellow. And now putting in the clouds with the titanium white, not straight white, however, just little tiny shapes for the clouds there. And all of this relates to the topic of self improvement in that you also want to leave room for creativity. You want to leave room for your own imagination. You can get caught up in this kind of trap of trying to make the thing look like the thing all the time, and then miss the whole point of the fact that you're creating a work of art. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% what you're looking at. And in fact, you can take as many liberties as you want, as you're seeing here. The The background is completely different. I even adjusted a little bit of the lighting so that the background and the foreground go together a little bit. Now we're putting in the little kind of grayish tone for the distant mountains in the background. And like I was saying, you want to leave a room for creativity. So you want to have a balance, kind of like gears in a car. You want to have a balance between incredibly realistic painting and then more impressionistic painting, like what you're seeing me do here with the background. And I think that that kind of creates a sort of harmony in the painting where there are elements that are selectively in focus, such as the face and the flowers, and in areas that aren't as much in focus to create uh, a type of journey that the viewer's eye makes as they look around onto the painting. And now I'm going to slow down my narration a little bit because I know I've been speaking kind of fast. So at this point, I'm now going to slow my narration down slightly. And what I'm doing there is just going over the background with the fan brush to try to make it softer so it pushes away from the foreground. And I'm just mixing up a kind of a bluish gray green for the halftones. At that point, I was painting in a halftone that was a little too blue for my liking. So then I eventually go and lighten it up with the titanium white, as you're seeing there, and then back into the ultramarine blue, just to lighten things up a little bit. Now, I never did achieve the type of look that I wanted with the drapery. I did want the drapery to be a little bit more realistic, but the model was not in a similar position as in the painting. So in the photo reference, the model's actually leaning to her side, but in the photo reference, or in the painting, sorry, I chose to make her seated, standing still. Remember, I'll post the photo reference on the Facebook photo reference group. So if you would like to have a larger version of the photo reference, you'll be able to access it there. And now with the a little more of a thinned out application of paint, again, I'm using Alla Prima and incorporating it into a more classical approach. So I'm still painting wet on wet. Um, so that means the thinner paint is sticking right onto the thicker paint. What I did was just use a little bit more of the odorless mineral spirits. And near the end of this painting, I did switch to turpentine just because, in my opinion, you don't have to use turpentine, but in my opinion, it kind of dilutes the paint a little better than odorless mineral spirits. So now we're putting in the little I don't know. I don't even know what to call it. I guess the little hair clips on the model's hair. There's a lot of stuff involved in the development of this painting, and what I want to do with each of these episodes now is to start to introduce more and more of how I actually paint. So a lot of the times when you see the demonstrations, my older demonstrations, they were all painted in one day. And now we're transitioning into day number 5 of the development of this painting. And as I said, the way that I actually paint does involve multiple days. For those of you that watch Dragon Ball Super, this is like watching me in almost my final form. So if you get that reference, final form, you still haven't seen me in my final form, because I actually do take even longer than a week, believe it or not, on a painting. So that's why I'm saying I might give myself a week. I don't know. I might have to skip 1 week one of these days to produce a 2 week long painting, and then have each subsequent video, so meaning uploading once a week, still maintaining my original schedule, but having at least 2 weeks to produce a painting. Now, on this day, the 5th day, I was really taking my time now with each smaller form. Now, this is something that I would have done had I done a underpainting first, and drawn it out with a pencil and then traced over it and things like that. But I chose not to do that in the beginning. I chose to go with Alla Prima and then continue to build and build and build. And this is what I'm doing now at this stage. And I actually, I went Black Friday shopping. I have a new wooden palette. For those of you that know me, I love to collect palettes. So I recently purchased a turtle wood palette, a second turtle wood palette. It's titled Pro Series 3. It's a smaller turtle wood palette, which I love this wooden palette. Now the flesh tone colors are pretty much identical. They're the same as the flesh tones that you have seen before. And if you're still curious about how to achieve these type of flesh tones in particular, again, the alizarin permanent with the sap green neutralized together and then combined with the flake white and burnt umber will get you towards these types of flesh tones. And now, as I didn't mention before, we're now returning to the regular narration speed as I slowed my narration down in the beginning, just to, not fill the video up with too much talk. Now, remember, when you're layering with oil paint, you want to layer lighter. So as you progress, you apply darker and darker tones. That's why you're seeing the eye that I'm working on here is actually getting darker. So with this technique, I began with Alla Prima, but still kept in mind that I wanted my values to be lighter and my edges to be softer. And now, as I'm starting to add more clarity to each one of these forms, the values are going to get darker, and I'm going to selectively make certain areas sharper. Now, the way that you make an edge soft is to do what you're seeing here, and I'm actually making edges soft in between given plane changes, and I'm trying to make softer edges and sharper edges communicate with the curvature of the forms of each area. And my goal in my painting is to achieve a certain effect that I have noticed in many of my top favorite painters, such as, in particular, John William Waterhouse and Nelson Shanks. To achieve a certain level of realism, quote unquote, realism with my paintings, yet not making them photographic. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with photographs or photorealistic painting. It's just that my own goal is to achieve a type of realism in painting that is reminiscent of what it's like for the human eye to observe the world, as opposed to, a photographic reproduction of it. And the paint is very thin. The application of paint is very thin. And when you layer darker, as we're layering here, you want to be very thin. And if you want to pull an area lighter, you want to make the paint even thicker. And I'm pretty much glazing at this point, meaning a semi-transparent application of oil paint, thinning the paint out with the Liquin medium and the Turpentine. So at this point, I'm using Turpentine to help the paint thin out a little bit more. Now I know that Turpentine is a type of taboo for most artists that I've read about on the internet, but oh well. I just decided to use the turpentine in this stage so that just in case I needed to paint on this, work on this painting another day, it would still dry overnight, which it did. And now we're going to move into another aspect of improving on your artwork, and that is to not get stuck on any one technique or any one school of thought. And that's going to be very important because the technique that you just saw me use here is a combination of the Alla Prima approach, as you saw in the beginning, and the classical finish that you're seeing in a lot of the more classically finished paintings that I've done. Combining them all together is actually making my painting process much faster. So to achieve this level of painting in a week for me would have been impossible. I think it would have been impossible had I went in with the transfer drawing and then underpainted it and then tried to glaze over it. I do not think I would have made it this far in just, what is it now? Um, 5 days, I think it is. I lost track. But at this point in the painting, I wouldn't have made it. I think if I had used the more, I guess, safe approach of drawing it out with a pencil and then going on with a monochromatic underpainting and then selectively rendering each area. So again, don't get caught up with one particular way or one particular school of thought. If someone tells you only use a limited palette, no, you should experiment with a wider range of colors. Someone tells you only use 22 or 25 or something colors, and that's the only way to paint. No, you need to experiment because the more experience you have, the more tools you will have at your disposal in order to, approach situations with much more power. And in terms of learning in general, I think it's also important to think about, when you're learning any other type of subject. Myself in particular, as a child, I've always had attention deficit disorder, ADD. I've always had this. So I'm always thinking, I'm always doing something. It's very hard for me to sit still. So usually when I'm working on a long painting or when I'm working like I usually do around 10 hours a day in the studio, I'll have Netflix playing on the side on my iPad as I was watching Netflix as I was painting at this very moment as you're seeing on the footage. So also know your learning style. My undergraduate degree is in math, so I spent a lot of time, studying math, and I always had music playing or something as I was going through formulations and proofs and things like that, and that helped me learn. So everyone has their own different learning style as well. So if you're someone that in school you did really, really well studying listening to music, then paint listening to music. If you did really, really well, um, you know, with absolute silence, then that's how you should paint. And the longer you spend on a painting, suppose you spend 3 hours on a painting and learn something completely new. The next time you may spend 2 hours to get to the point where you achieved painting in 3 hours. And then you will just keep progressing in that way. And in that sense, something that would have taken you 5 hours to figure out, drawing or proportion wise a year ago, you can now do in 5 minutes. So that's the same kind of learning curve in painting that you could, compare to learning in other subjects. And now again, I'm going to slow down the narration as you're seeing a little light glaze here, again with the alizarin permanent. burnt umber and a little bit of yellow ochre. And remember, glazing is just the application of semi-transparent layers of oil paint using a medium, whether it be Liquin as I used this time, or Neo McGill, whichever medium you'd like to use to thin out the paint, and then just apply an even distribution of color. And this actually is referred to as, I've heard of it referred to as half pasting. So I'm actually painting thinner, lighter for the clouds. This is usually not something that I recommend to do on flesh tones. When you're going lighter on flesh tones, I recommend going more opaque. But when you're working transparent, it actually produces a nice effect. So this is now going to be the transition into the 6th and final day. And here you can actually see a little glimpse, a small glimpse of my new turtlewood palette. Now, on the 6th day, I decided to go in and put in more clarity into the clavicle. Now, I know you can't see the clavicle on the photo reference, but it wouldn't help anyway because the model isn't in the same position. So in the final day, I had to do some corrections there for the clavicles, and compositionally, the drapery, the little curve of the drapery was a little too similar to the curve of the model's shoulder. So eventually, I will go in and work on the symmetry. And symmetry is something you really want to watch out for, especially in composition. I see this in a lot of still life. If things are too symmetrical, oh, and by the way, I added in a 5th flower. If you're seeing the photo reference has only 4 visible flowers, I added a 5th. For some reason, I tend to favor odd numbers and groupings of elements in compositions. I also, like I mentioned before, I watch out for too much symmetry. As you see, even with the earrings, there I am kind of comparing the angle for the shoulder and realizing it's too similar to the angle of the drapery. So even with the earrings, I have one that's high, I have one that's low. I try not to have any of the, the elements of the hair too evenly spaced from one another. Even the folds of the drapery, I try to make sure that the pattern of the folds of the drapery are not too heavily repetitive. So those are the kind of things I watch out for in composition. And I want to reiterate something that I mentioned briefly in the footage of the previous day before this one. I'm going to make this analogy. Okay, so if you can achieve something in 3 hours, something completely new that you've never achieved in your painting before, you may be able to achieve it in less time on another painting. And then if you achieve that new achievement in less time in your next painting, you might unlock yet something else new that day. And this is again is a cycle that continues. And the only way that you can progress is to put in the time, the hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours it takes in order to master your craft and in order to gain more of an understanding of what you're trying to create. And I really tend to think along the lines of what Bob Ross said. Hopefully, I can get his quote right. At this point, hopefully, I can memorize his quote. He said that talent is nothing more than a pursued interest. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong in the recollection of that quote, but a pursued interest. If you have an interest in something and a passion in something, you can learn it. Everyone always says if you can draw, you can paint. And I've always heard this saying that drawing is a very learnable subject. It just depends on who you're trying to stuff the knowables. I remember that's something that Nelson Shank said in one of his demos, meaning that if drawing is something that anyone can learn, and anyone that can draw can learn to paint, then learning to paint is definitely within the capability of anyone that is willing to put in the hundreds of hours necessary to develop their skills. Now, in terms of the painting, what I'm trying to do here is just make this edge soft, this edge that follows right into the shadow. And as you see with the fold of the fabric, I purposefully made that fold point towards one of the elements of the hair, and it creates kind of a spiral that goes from one corner to the canvas. The fold goes into the hair, and then the hair kind of loops over to the flowers and loops again towards the other side of the hair, and then brings you towards the face. And then all of that is contrasted by all of the elements in the background. So that's a kind of compositional game that you can play along with your paintings. And again, composition is one of my biggest weaknesses. And, I think that lately I have been progressing in my own compositions just by, not being too subject to the photo reference. I'm trying more and more now to break away from solely trying to reproduce a photo reference or solely trying to perfectly match what I'm looking at. And, I think that's part of my learning recently is in order to, take, uh, certain elements that I see from nature and then combine it with imagination. And this is going to conclude the 6th and final day that I worked on this painting. Yes, I was definitely cutting it close with this week's episode. But that being said, I really hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. If you would like to watch more painting videos like this one, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you would like to support my channel even more, I have a Patreon account. And if you would like to purchase any of my oil paintings, I'll have a link to my Etsy shop down below. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.